For many decades now, since the study of the Armenian genocide found its way in wider academia, the domain was mainly, and in some cases solely, limited to the study of archival materials, documents, statistics, reports, historical and official letters and telegrams. Artistic representation of the genocide, like historical fiction, realist fiction, the narrative poetry of historical content, and so on, were appreciated as artistic responses, but were pushed aside as sources of historical research. As to the memoirs of the survivors, there was a total rejection of the notion that these accounts could introduce an effective and valid field of inquiry beyond this scientific domain. Historians argued that the memoirist, especially writing years after the event, adopts an individualistic approach, exaggerates and beautifies, and writes down what his or her fading memory serves. I belong to the band of scholars who argued for years for the validity of this bulk of literature. In my presentation today, based on my previous publications in which a great importance is rendered to survivors' memoirs and diaries in understanding the genocide, I will argue against such characterization and the notion of fading memory. I will expound the important contribution of this literature to the genocide studies. As we know today, some survivors kept a diary during the years of the genocide. Others began writing about their experiences in the safety of their new habitat years later. However, in many of these accounts, in these manuscripts, did not see the light. They were not shared even with the closest relatives. Then why did they write their stories if they were not being shared? Well, concerning the memoirs, one can surmise that penning the gruesome experiences, they were making a subconscious effort to begin the process of healing. Anderson and McCarty explained that. And indeed, the survivors were subconsciously exorcising the trauma that was untangling their mind and preventing them from grasping normal reality. Variously, the purpose of keeping a diary was to document the event as much as possible. Later, tell the world what happened to Armenians. In fact, it served as a strong motivation to survive. Statements like, I decided to do everything to stay alive and tell the world about the Turkish atrocities. Or, I will not survive this calamity, but you go on and tell the world what happened to us. Yet, the situation in the New World had its own parameters. Overwhelmed by everyday struggle and faced with the indifference of the world toward the fate of the Armenian nation, many survivors kept their silence and buried their manuscripts as a grand secret of their life. But those which were entrusted to or rescued by the next generation and were published in their original Armenian or translated into more accessible languages. One example is Hrant Saryan's diary that was translated into French by his daughter Louise Kiefer under the title Le Journal de mon Père. Armenian genocide historiography has identified phases of implementation. The disarmament of the Armenian populace is one. It is in these diaries and memoirs that we were informed of the procedure, the details of the brutality by which government officials searched Armenian houses for hidden arms, as men were tortured and women stripped and thrown into the river if weapons were not turned in. The deportation order and the preparation was an opportunity for the Muslim neighbors to plunder Armenian houses. Peran Saryan, Mushaghish Khan, Hambarsum Chitshan, and many others attest to it. Then the deportation route and concentration camps with purposeful organized incidents to cause attrition in the caravan of helpless women, children, and old men. We know Aleppo as the city of last resort, a haven compared to Deir el-Zor, Ras al-Ain, Raqqa, and other camps, concentration camp, desert camps. We know about orphanages in Aleppo, but it is Saryan's, John Minassian's, and others' testimonies that we can see the true picture of the orphanages, the prevailing misery, filth, and contagious diseases, the attacks of Arabs and Turkish soldiers to loot the orphanage, kidnap young girls, and kill the orphans and the staff. Memoirs, even those written decades later, are as reliable and factually accurate as diaries, because the memory of a catastrophic experience does not fade. The details of these experiences form everlasting and indelible iconic images in the survivor's mind. I remember everything so clearly, as if it happened yesterday, survivors would tell you. Yerevan continually reiterated, now that I'm relating, everything is in my mind. It is all before my eyes. A case in point, memoirs written years later, unlike day-to-day diaries, are rich with emotional impact of the experience, adding a human dimension to the documentation of the event. The traumatic experience in the diaries seemed to be raw, undigested. But as Judith Herman explains, the recordings annotate moments and images that will remain permanently encoded in the writer's mind. In the memoirs, as Christine van Bohemen puts it, the trauma victim, instead of reflecting on the trauma in a narrative account, lives out and repeats the event, which always escapes conscious articulation. Only through repetition and replay may the event caused by the trauma eventually, the event that caused the trauma eventually crystallize into experience and narrative. Describing the scenes that have nestled in his memory for life, Chitshan explains, if you have not witnessed these atrocities, your mind could never perceive that such savagery could be committed by human beings. The ravine and both brinks of Perry River were totally covered with corpses. The limbs of babies were sticking here and there, the putrid odor of the decaying bodies. The bridge that led to the village of Hushi was impassable with bodies piled up on it, some headless, some with their guts hanging out. Just try to forget that image, he explains. Ah, ah. Arshalius Mardikian did what no other memoirist had done with their harrowing experience. It began with writing her memoir as early as 1918, when no other survivor dared yet to confront the past. But that was not enough. She relived an entire traumatic experience, not only while writing her memoir, but also while playing the role of her own character in the movie. The line of naked, crucified Armenian girls, including the close-up of herself on a cross staged for the film, and the torture, the rape, and the beating. Anthony Slide has befittingly described her as a young woman terrorized in her own country, then brought to the United States and mercilessly exploited by the film industry. History accounts for close to 300,000 orphans, leftovers from the carnage, young boys and girls in orphanages, captives in Muslim houses, or left wandering in streets. But in Nargis Jangochian's, Mardiganian's, Gurerian's, and others' memoirs that paint the ugly picture of life in Turkish, Kurdish, or Arab households, orphans exploited, like abused as servants, shepherds, concubines, and the total destruction of that generation. It is memoirs like Garnik Banyan's or Chichian's that bring to light the savagery, the atrocious methods of Turkification of the orphans, and the true character of the Cemal Pasha, Halide Adib, and others in charge. Vazgen Shushanyan pictures the predicament of these orphans' miserable life in the streets. I tasted the danger of an unbridled adolescence in filthy streets corners. I grew up with other street boys, and our best friends were the leprous and hungry dogs. It is through Mardiganian's ravished Armenia that we learn about the horrible fate of the Armenian girls, dishonored, abused, tortured, sold in the slave markets, or used as sex slaves in the hands of Turkish and Kurdish men, from simple peasants to ranking officials, government officials. History does not speak of these hidden. What's more, commonalities of description in memoirs and diaries testify to the truth of the genocide. William Zinsser writes, if you stop a dark corner of the overarching trauma. Arshalius Mardikian's memoir made a tremendous impact in the United States after 1919, 1920s. A quarter of a century later, it was Anne Frank's diary to play that same role for the Americans to understand the Jewish Holocaust. The memoirs are living history with a power more than documents and statistics to touch people, to transmit knowledge and information, the greatest tools, as Thomas Hammerberg has it, to promote empathy and break down intolerance, prejudice, and hatred. A byproduct of this argument is the importance of memoirs as educational tools and as carriers of historical memory to inculcate the Armenian identity. Jewish Holocaust scholarship has long acknowledged the effectiveness of memoirs in the study of Shoah. and the role they can play in the Jewish collective consciousness. In another part of the world, in response to another genocide, which was euphemistically called Stalinist purges, the memorial movement was launched to collect and register fervently, as much as possible, the memoirs of Stalin's Gulag as the only source of documents of social life in the USSR to counter Soviet historiography. Alas, the movement was halted. The collected precious material was pushed under the shroud of oblivion. With the continuing denial of the Armenian genocide and the disappearing of survivors as witnesses of the Great Horror, memoirs and recorded oral testimonies carried the burden of proclaiming the truth, as Berta Nakchian-Kechian maintains in her memoir. Her fight against denialism. I was there. I was a witness. And to conclude, Yosef Haim Yerushalmi asserts, somehow reluctantly, the Holocaust has already engendered more historical research than any single event in Jewish history. But I have no doubt whatsoever that its image is being shaped not as the historians avail, but in the novelist's crucible. Of course, he means the fictionalized history of the Holocaust. Yehuda Bauer warns against the metaphysical comprehension of Holocaust. So, departure from historiographic methodology may be questionable for some historians, but documents, statistics, and data do not provide the full story. Statistics don't bleed. It is not possible to penetrate the world of the Armenian genocide without reading the memoirs, the artistic literature. They have the power to capture the unthinkable horrors of genocide and bring it down to the level of the reader's imagination. Undeniable is the power and intensity of impact of the genocide literature can make, and the crucial role this genocide literature, memoirs, and testimonies can play. Thank you for your attention, but I cannot stop here without saying a word about the war, the horrendous war going on today, and taking such a heavy toll of our precious young generation. The assurance of our healthy, happy Armenian future. Years from now, I'm sure Azeri and Armenian historians will write the history of this war. My only hope is that there will be witnesses, there will be enough memoirs of the witnesses of this war, the Armenian side, the Armenian witnesses and players of this event, with their literature to enhance the history of that war, to give it warmth and wisdom. And thank you again.